My cousin Bryce always said I had more stubbornness than sense, and that Sunday morning in the Cascades proved him right, in the worst possible way. I was driving a beat-up Chevy Silverado through Stevens Pass, hauling cardboard boxes full of everything I owned after my divorce had finalized 3 months earlier. Most guys from my high school class of 2005 were settled into mortgages and raising their second kids by then. But there I was, relocating from Portland to Spokane for a warehouse supervisor gig that promised a fresh start. The route through the mountains usually took about 4 hours, a drive I had made dozens of times visiting Bryce during his college years at Gonzaga. That particular morning started gray but calm, the typical Pacific Northwest winter sky hanging low over the evergreens. I left at 7, figuring I would arrive well before dinner, well before any serious weather could roll in. The radio mentioned an incoming system, but forecasts in that region changed every hour, and I had learned to take them with a grain of salt. 60 miles east of Everett, an electronic highway sign blinked its warning. Chains required ahead. Consider alternate route. I pulled into a Shell station to top off the tank and grab a large coffee, and the woman working the register, a heavyset lady with bifocals and a Seahawks lanyard around her neck, asked where I was headed. When I mentioned Stevens Pass, she tilted her head and gave me a look like I had just told her I planned to kayak across the Pacific. She said the pass had been a mess all week, that 2 semis jackknifed up there on Friday and the plows were struggling to keep up. The smart money, she told me, was on taking the long way around through Wenatchee, adding maybe 3 hours but guaranteeing I would actually arrive. I thanked her, grabbed my coffee, and walked back to my truck without changing my plans. Bryce was expecting me for dinner. I had a job orientation first thing Monday, and those patches of blue sky breaking through the clouds to the east seemed like a good enough omen to keep going. The snow started falling about 20 minutes past the gas station. Light flurries at first that danced across my windshield like confetti. I remember thinking it was almost pretty, the way the flakes caught the gray morning light as they drifted down through the Douglas firs lining the highway. But within 15 minutes, those gentle flurries had thickened into something else entirely. The wipers went from occasional swipes to a constant rhythm, struggling to keep up with the accumulation. I dropped my speed from 60 to 50, then 45, watching the road ahead transform from wet asphalt to a white carpet that grew deeper by the minute. Other vehicles had thinned out considerably. I passed maybe 3 cars heading the opposite direction, all of them coated in snow and moving cautiously. A part of me, the sensible part that I had spent 30 years ignoring, suggested I turn around. But I had already committed, already driven past the last easy exit, and the stubborn part of my brain insisted the worst would be over once I crested the summit. I reached the final warning point around 10 in the morning, a physical barricade with flashing lights and a sign that read, "Road closed, do not enter, severe weather." A highway patrol car sat empty beside the barricade, its windows completely obscured by accumulated snow, and I could see tire tracks in the fresh powder where other vehicles had clearly gone around the barrier. That detail sealed my decision. If other people had pushed through, then the closure was probably just a precaution, standard procedure for liability purposes. I eased my Silverado around the orange cones and continued up the pass, telling myself I would be through the worst of it in an hour, maybe less. The road climbed steadily, the snow now falling so thick that my headlights barely penetrated 20 feet ahead. I could feel the tires losing traction on the curves, that sickening moment of float before the treads caught again. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed 19 degrees and dropping, and the wind had picked up enough to send sheets of white across the road in sideways curtains that made it nearly impossible to see the lane markings. The Silverado finally gave up about 2 miles past the summit marker, though I could barely read the sign through the whiteout conditions. I felt the back end fishtail on a curve, overcorrected, and then the front tires hit a drift that had blown across the road like a frozen wave. The truck lurched forward, buried itself up to the bumper, and the engine stalled out with a shudder that I felt in my chest. I tried to restart it, heard the motor turn over twice, 3 times, but the wheels just spun uselessly against the packed snow beneath them. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the wind howl against the windows and watching the snow pile up on the hood in real time. My phone showed no signal, not a single bar, and the dashboard clock read 10:47 in the morning. I had plenty of gas, a quarter tank at least, and I figured I could run the heater in intervals to stay warm until a plow came through. That was my plan. That was what I told myself as I watched the world outside disappear into a wall of white. It took about an hour for me to realize I was not alone on that stretch of road. The snow had eased slightly around noon, dropping from a complete whiteout to something more like heavy flurries, and that was when I first noticed the shape about 50 yards ahead, a dark outline barely visible through the gray haze. At first I thought it was a boulder or maybe a drift that had formed around a guardrail, but as my eyes adjusted, I recognized the angular silhouette of a vehicle. A sedan, compact, completely buried except for the top third of its frame. I squinted through my windshield, wiping away the fog with my sleeve, and that was when I spotted the second one, further up the road, off to the right, tilted at an angle that suggested it had slid into the drainage ditch. A minivan, dark-colored, its side mirror poking out of the snow like a periscope. The realization crept over me slowly. Those tire tracks I had followed past the barricade, the ones that made me feel justified in my decision, they belonged to people who had made the same stupid choice I did, and none of them had made it through either. I waited another 30 minutes before deciding to check on the other vehicles. The rational part of my brain said there might be other people out there, maybe someone with a working phone or a better plan than sitting in a freezing truck hoping for rescue. I bundled up as best I could. A fleece jacket, a hoodie underneath, work gloves that were not designed for this kind of cold, and pushed open my door against the wind. The snow came up past my knees immediately, and the cold hit my face like a slap, sharp and vicious in a way that made my eyes water. I trudged toward the sedan first, each step a battle against the drifts, my breath forming thick clouds that the wind tore away instantly. It took me nearly 10 minutes to cover those 50 yards. When I finally reached the car, a silver Toyota, probably a Corolla, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The driver's side window had scratches on the inside, long, frantic marks in the frost, like someone had been clawing at the glass. The door handle was packed with ice, frozen solid, and when I tried to pull it open, it would not budge. I wiped snow from the window and pressed my face close, cupping my hands around my eyes to see inside. The car was empty. A purse sat on the passenger seat, its contents spilled across the floor mats. Lipstick, a wallet, loose coins scattered like someone had been searching desperately for something. The minivan was worse. I almost did not make it there. The wind had picked up again, and every few seconds a gust would hit me hard enough to make me stagger sideways. But I kept going, driven by some morbid need to understand what had happened on this road before I arrived. The minivan sat at a steep angle in the ditch, its front end buried so deep that the hood was completely invisible beneath the snow. As I got closer, I could see that the sliding door on the passenger side was open, or rather, it had been open at some point before the snow sealed it in place. A thick ridge of ice now filled the gap, like the door had frozen mid-motion. I circled around to the driver's side, and that was when I saw the footprints. They were almost completely filled in, just shallow depressions in the snow that led away from the vehicle and up the slope toward the tree line. Small footprints like a woman, or maybe a teenager, spaced far apart in a way that suggested running. I followed them with my eyes as far as I could, maybe 30 feet up the hill, before they disappeared entirely into the white void between the pines. Whoever had left those tracks had fled into the forest during a blizzard, and I could not imagine any scenario where that ended well. I made it back to my truck around 1 in the afternoon, shaking so hard I could barely grip the door handle. The cold had seeped through my clothes, through my skin, settling into my bones like something alive. I started the engine and cranked the heater to maximum, holding my hands over the vents until the pain in my fingers shifted from numbness to a sharp, prickling burn. My mind kept circling back to those scratches on the Toyota's window, those frantic marks that told a story I did not want to understand. The woman in that car, I assumed it was a woman based on the purse, had tried to claw her way out. The door must have frozen shut, trapping her inside, and she had panicked. But the car was empty now, which meant she had eventually escaped somehow. Maybe someone had helped her. Maybe she had found another way out. I kept telling myself variations of that story. Versions where everyone made it to safety, where the footprints leading into the woods belonged to someone who found shelter at a ranger station or a cabin. But the purse on the seat, the wallet still inside with what I assumed was ID and credit cards. Nobody leaves that behind unless they are running from something more urgent than a storm. The temperature dropped faster than I expected once the sun began its descent behind the mountains. By 3 in the afternoon, the light had turned a dull, bluish gray, and my dashboard thermometer showed 4 degrees. I had been running the engine in 15-minute intervals, trying to conserve gas while keeping the cab warm enough to survive. During one of those quiet periods, with the motor off and the wind screaming outside, I heard something that made every muscle in my body go rigid. A horn. 3 short blasts, distant but unmistakable, coming from somewhere further down the pass behind me. I sat up straight, heart hammering, and waited. A few seconds later, it came again. 3 honks, weaker this time, followed by silence. Someone else was out there, someone still in their vehicle, still alive and trying to signal for help. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and considered going out there, considered trudging back down the road to find them. But the light was fading fast. The snow had picked up again, and I knew with grim certainty that if I left my truck now, I might never find my way back to it. So I did something that still keeps me awake some nights. I stayed where I was. I listened to that horn go silent and I did nothing. The night that followed was the longest of my life. I ran out of gas around 8 in the evening, and after that the cold became something I cannot adequately describe to anyone who has not experienced it. It was not just uncomfortable, it was predatory, relentless, squeezing the warmth out of my body degree by degree. I wrapped myself in everything I had, a sleeping bag from my camping gear, 2 jackets layered over each other, a wool blanket I'd packed for my new apartment. I curled into a ball on the back seat and watched my breath form crystals in the air, watched the frost creep across the inside of the windows like a living thing spreading its fingers. Sleep came in short, dangerous bursts. I would drift off for 20 minutes and wake up shivering so violently that my teeth ached. At some point during the darkest hours, I heard another sound outside, something that was not wind. Footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps moving past my truck, heading up the road toward the buried sedan. I wanted to call out, wanted to bang on the window and signal for help, but something stopped me. The footsteps were too steady, too deliberate for someone struggling through waist-deep snow. They moved with a purpose I did not understand, and by the time I convinced myself to look out the frosted window, there was nothing to see but darkness and swirling white. The rescue team found me around 6 the next morning, a convoy of snowplows and emergency vehicles that had started clearing the pass at first light. I was hypothermic, barely coherent, mumbling about horns and footprints and scratches on windows. They loaded me into an ambulance and wrapped me in thermal blankets, and I remember the paramedic, a young guy with a beard and kind eyes, telling me I was lucky to be alive. It was not until 2 days later, recovering in a hospital in Wenatchee, that I learned the full scope of what had happened on Stevens Pass that night. 3 other people had ignored the road closure, same as me. An elderly man in a Honda SUV was found dead from cardiac arrest, his vehicle buried a quarter mile behind where I'd been stuck. He was the one honking for help, the one I had abandoned. A young mother and her teenage daughter had been in the minivan. The daughter was found alive but severely frostbitten, huddled in a maintenance shed about a mile up the mountain. Her mother was not so fortunate. They found her body in the woods, 200 yards from the road, frozen in a seated position against a tree. The official report said she had become disoriented, trying to find help and succumbed to exposure. But her daughter, when she was well enough to talk, told a different story. She said they had seen someone walking on the road that night, a figure moving through the storm without a flashlight, without struggling against the snow. Her mother had gone out to flag them down, to ask for help. She never came back. I never made it to that job orientation in Spokane. Bryce drove down to Wenatchee to pick me up from the hospital. and I spent 2 weeks at his place recovering, both physically and mentally. The frostbite on my fingers healed, leaving only some numbness in my left pinky that flares up in cold weather. The other wounds took longer. I spent months wondering about that figure the girl described, running through every possible explanation. Maybe it was another stranded driver, delirious from hypothermia, wandering the pass in a confused state. Maybe it was a local who lived nearby and had ventured out to check on the road. The police investigated but found nothing conclusive. No footprints survived the storm. No witnesses besides a traumatized teenager whose account was dismissed as shock-induced confusion. I moved to Spokane eventually, took a different job, built a quiet life far from mountain passes and winter storms. But every December, when the snow starts falling and the weather reports warn about dangerous conditions, I think about that night. I think about the horn I ignored, the scratches on that frozen window, the footprints leading into the woods. And I think about what the girl said, about her mother walking towards someone who was moving through a blizzard like it was nothing, like the cold did not touch them. I have no answers, just a rule I follow without exception now. When a road is closed, I turn around. Some warnings are not suggestions. Some mistakes you only get to make once. Christmas Eve fell on a Wednesday that year, and my mother had insisted on hosting the entire extended family at her farmhouse outside of Greenville, South Carolina. I had graduated from college in 2012, spent a decade bouncing between marketing jobs in Atlanta, and had only recently moved back closer to home after my divorce finalized in the spring. My mother's place sat on 11 acres of land that had belonged to my grandparents, a sprawling white house with wraparound porches and rooms that always smelled faintly of cedar and old books. 23 people were expected that night: aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, and a few family friends who had nowhere else to go. I arrived around 4 in the afternoon to help set up, and even then, before anyone else showed up, I noticed my mother moving through the kitchen with a tightness in her jaw that I recognized from my childhood. She was nervous about something, and when I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and said, everyone needed to behave themselves this year. By 7 o'clock, the house was full and loud in that particular way large families get during holidays. Conversations overlapping, children running through hallways, the constant clink of glasses and silverware. My Uncle Vernon's widow, a woman named Francine who had remarried a man none of us particularly liked, arrived with her new husband Douglas and immediately began commenting on how the house looked smaller than she remembered. My cousin Ray, who had driven down from Charlotte with his girlfriend Megan, was already on his 3rd bourbon before dinner was served. I watched from the corner of the living room as my brother Alan spoke in hushed, urgent tones with our mother near the back staircase, their faces tight with something I could not read from across the room. The fireplace crackled behind me, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, and I remember thinking that the warmth in that house felt artificial somehow, like we were all performing comfort rather than actually feeling it. When my mother finally called everyone to the dining room, I caught Alan staring at Douglas with an expression that made my chest tighten. Something was building beneath the surface of all that holiday cheer, and I could feel it pressing against the walls like steam in a kettle. Dinner started civil enough, with my mother saying grace and everyone bowing their heads in that performative way families do when they want to appear unified. The table was beautiful: roasted turkey, honey-glazed ham, 3 kinds of casseroles, and my grandmother's china that only came out twice a year. But by the time dessert plates were being cleared, the bourbon and wine had done their work, and the conversation had shifted from safe topics like weather and football to the one subject my mother had explicitly asked everyone to avoid: my grandfather's will. Douglas, who had been married to Francine for less than 2 years, made a comment about how the farmhouse was too big for one woman to maintain alone, and how it might make sense to consider selling before property values dropped. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the ice settling in someone's glass. My brother Alan set down his fork with deliberate slowness, looked directly at Douglas, and asked him what exactly made him think he had any say in what happened to our family's land. Francine tried to intervene, placing her hand on Douglas's arm, but he shook her off and said something about being realistic, about not letting sentiment cloud good financial judgment. What happened next unfolded in fragments that I have replayed in my mind hundreds of times since. Alan stood up from his chair so fast it scraped against the hardwood with a sound like a small scream. My mother was saying something, trying to calm things down, but her voice was drowned out by Ray, who had stumbled to his feet and was pointing at Douglas with a finger that wavered slightly from the alcohol. Accusations started flying, old grievances that had nothing to do with the will, things about money borrowed and never returned, about Francine abandoning my Uncle Vernon during his illness to take up with Douglas before Vernon was even in the ground. I remember Megan, Ray's girlfriend, pulling out her phone and starting to record, her face pale and uncertain, like she was not sure if she should be documenting this or running from it. Douglas pushed back from the table and stood, his chair toppling behind him, and he said something about not needing to take this from people who had never accomplished anything in their lives. The children had gone quiet in the next room. The Christmas tree lights blinked red and green against the window, cheerful and absurd against the ugliness spreading through that dining room like spilled wine across white linen. My mother managed to separate everyone by suggesting we take a break, let things cool down. Douglas and Francine retreated to the guest room on the second floor, and I could hear their muffled argument bleeding through the ceiling as I helped clear dishes in the kitchen. Alan had gone outside to smoke on the back porch, something he only did when he was truly upset, and Ray had passed out on the couch in the den with Megan sitting beside him, scrolling through her phone with a troubled expression. The other relatives had scattered, some to the front porch, some to their cars to retrieve forgotten gifts, a few of the older cousins taking the children upstairs to watch a movie and escape the tension. I found myself alone with my mother in the kitchen around 11, both of us washing dishes in silence, and that was when she told me something that changed everything. She said Douglas had been pressuring Francine for months to contest the will, claiming that my grandfather had not been of sound mind when he wrote it, and that Francine deserved a larger share as Vernon's widow. My mother's hands were deep in soapy water, but I could see the tremor running through her shoulders. She said Alan had found emails between Douglas and a lawyer in Charlotte, emails that outlined a strategy to claim the farmhouse and the land, and that Alan had confronted Douglas about it 3 weeks earlier in a phone call that had ended with threats on both sides. I asked my mother why she had not told me any of this before, and she just shook her head and said she had hoped it would blow over, that Douglas would realize he was outnumbered and outmatched and just let it go. But now, standing in that kitchen with the sounds of a fractured family echoing through the house, she admitted she had been foolish to think pride and greed could ever be reasoned with. Around midnight, people started gathering again in the living room, a tradition in our family to exchange gifts after the clock struck 12, a holdover from when my grandparents wanted to stretch Christmas across 2 calendar days. The mood was tense but controlled, like everyone had silently agreed to pretend the dinner argument had never happened. Douglas and Francine came downstairs, and I noticed Douglas had changed his shirt, the previous one having been stained with wine during the confrontation. He was smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes, making small talk with cousins who answered in monosyllables and avoided his gaze. Alan stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, watching Douglas with the focused attention of someone waiting for a reason to act. I positioned myself near the hallway, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to have a clear path to the kitchen or the front door. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked toward 12:30, and I remember thinking that if we could just get through the next hour, everyone would retreat to their rooms and we could survive until morning. The gift exchange was awkward and rushed, people tearing through wrapping paper without enthusiasm, murmuring thanks that sounded hollow in the strained atmosphere. I had just finished opening a scarf from one of my aunts when I heard raised voices coming from the staircase landing. Douglas and Alan had drifted away from the group at some point, and now they stood at the top of the stairs, their silhouettes visible through the wooden railing. I could not make out the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable, low and venomous, the kind of conversation that happens between clenched teeth. Francine noticed too and started moving toward the stairs, calling Douglas's name with a sharpness that cut through the ambient noise. My mother grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks I would find the next morning. Everything after that happened in a span of maybe 4 seconds, but in my memory it stretches out like taffy, each moment distinct and terrible. There was a sound, not a shout exactly, but something guttural and surprised, and then the heavy, stuttering crash of a body tumbling down the staircase. Douglas came down those stairs in a way no conscious person ever would, his limbs loose and flailing, his head striking the banister twice before he landed in a heap at the bottom, one leg bent at an angle that made my cousin's daughter start screaming from the doorway of the den. Chaos erupted in a way that felt both instantaneous and impossibly slow. Francine was screaming Douglas's name over and over, pushing past people to reach him, her hands hovering over his body like she was afraid to touch him and confirm what we could all already see. His neck was wrong, tilted in a direction that necks do not tilt, and his eyes were open but looking at nothing, fixed on a point somewhere past the ceiling. My mother was calling for someone to dial 911, and I heard Ray's voice from somewhere behind me saying that he was on it, his words slurred but urgent. Alan had not moved from the top of the stairs. He stood there with both hands gripping the railing, his face pale and slack, staring down at Douglas's crumpled form with an expression I could not read. Shock, maybe, or something colder. I pushed through the crowd and knelt beside Francine, pressing 2 fingers to Douglas's wrist even though I already knew there would be no pulse. His skin was still warm, and that detail struck me as profoundly cruel, how the body holds on to heat even after everything else has fled. Someone had turned off the Christmas music that had been playing softly from the speakers, and in the silence I could hear Francine's ragged breathing, the distant wail of the ambulance that Ray had summoned, and my own heartbeat pounding so loud in my ears it seemed impossible that no one else could hear it. The paramedics arrived within 15 minutes, followed closely by 2 sheriff's deputies who took statements from everyone present. Alan told them he and Douglas had been talking on the landing, that Douglas had been drinking heavily and stumbled backward, losing his balance and falling before Alan could grab him. His voice was steady when he said this, his eyes meeting the deputies without wavering, and I watched him sign the written statement with a hand that did not tremble. Francine was too hysterical to give a coherent account, and the deputies decided to interview her the following day once she had calmed down. The rest of us corroborated what we could. Yes, there had been tension at dinner. Yes, Douglas had been drinking. Yes, we had heard raised voices but had not seen the actual fall. The deputies seemed satisfied, treating the whole thing as a tragic accident, the kind of thing that happens when alcohol and steep old staircases mix. By 3 in the morning, Douglas's body had been taken away. Francine had been sedated by a doctor someone called, and the remaining family members had either gone to bed or driven home in stunned silence. I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Something was gnawing at my mind, a detail I could not quite grasp, like a word stuck on the tip of my tongue. I fell asleep without finding it, but it was waiting for me when I woke. 3 days later, I was back in Atlanta trying to resume some version of normal life, when Megan called me. Ray had given her my number, she said, and she needed to talk to someone in the family who was not directly involved in what she called the situation. Her voice was tight and nervous, and she kept pausing like she was checking to make sure no one was listening. She told me she had been going through the videos on her phone, the ones she had taken during the dinner argument, and she had noticed something strange. After the fight at dinner, she had stopped recording, but her phone had been in her hand when she dozed off next to Ray on the couch. At some point, she must have accidentally hit the record button because there was a 23-minute video of mostly nothing, the ceiling of the den, muffled voices, the sound of her own breathing as she slept. But at the 14-minute mark, the audio picked up something distinct. Alan's voice and Douglas's voice, not arguing exactly, but speaking in low, intense tones. She could not make out every word, but she heard Alan say something like, "This ends tonight," and Douglas responding with what sounded like, "You do not have the nerve." The timestamp on that section of video was 12:27, roughly 5 minutes before the fall. Megan said she had not shown this to anyone else, not even Ray, because she did not know what it meant and she was scared of what it might mean. I told Megan to send me the video and she did, and I sat in my apartment with headphones pressed tight against my ears, listening to that recording over and over until the words became grooves worn into my brain. The audio was muffled and imperfect, but Alan's voice was unmistakable. I had grown up with that voice, heard it tease me and comfort me and lie to our parents about broken windows and stolen cookies. "This ends tonight," he said, and there was something in his tone I had never heard before, something flat and final like a door closing. I called my mother the next morning and asked her, as casually as I could manage, what Alan had told the insurance investigator who had come by to assess the circumstances of Douglas's death. She went quiet for a long moment, then asked me why I wanted to know. I said I was just trying to process everything, and she accepted that, telling me Alan had repeated the same story. Douglas stumbled. Alan tried to catch him. It all happened too fast. But then she mentioned something that sent a cold spike through my chest. She said Francine had finally given her statement to the deputies, and in it she claimed that Douglas's phone was missing. He always kept it in his back pocket, she said, but it was not on his body when the paramedics arrived, and no one had been able to find it since. Francine was convinced someone had taken it, though she could not say who or why, and the deputies had noted her concern, but seemed to consider it a minor detail in the larger tragedy. But I knew it was not a minor detail. Douglas had been documenting everything. The emails with the lawyer, the text messages with Francine about the will, probably recordings of his own conversations with family members. If someone wanted to erase evidence of premeditation or motive, that phone would be the first thing to disappear. I thought about calling the sheriff's office, about handing over Megan's recording and telling them about the missing phone and the emails Alan had found. But every time I reached for my own phone, I pictured my brother's face, my mother's face, the farmhouse that had held 4 generations of my family. I thought about what it would mean to accuse Alan publicly, to tear apart what remained of our family over suspicions I could not prove, and a recording that might mean nothing at all. In the end, I did something I am not proud of. I called Alan directly and told him I knew about the conversation before the fall, that I had audio and that Francine was asking questions about Douglas's missing phone. The silence on his end of the line lasted so long, I thought he had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured, and he said only this: Douglas was going to destroy everything our grandparents built. He fell. That is what happened, and that is what everyone believes, and you need to ask yourself what kind of sister you want to be. He hung up before I could respond. I still have Megan's recording saved on a hard drive in my closet. I still think about Francine, alone in some other state now, living with a grief I helped shape by staying silent. Some nights I convince myself that Douglas really did stumble, that Alan's words were just the frustrated venting of a man protecting his family, that the missing phone was lost in the chaos and nothing more. But most nights, I lie awake and replay those 4 seconds in my mind, the guttural sound, the crash, my brother's hands gripping the railing, and I know that I chose my family over the truth. I do not know if I will ever be able to live with that choice, but I have learned that living with it and making peace with it are 2 very different things. Driving for a private delivery app became my second job right after I graduated community college, and by December of 2022, I had been doing it long enough to know the rhythm of the work. 26 years old, splitting my time between warehouse shifts and evening deliveries, finally putting some real money aside for the first time in my life. That particular night, December 24th, I had already knocked out 8 stops across the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, and I was ready to call it quits by 9 so I could make it to my mom's place for our traditional late dinner. She always waited for me no matter how late I ran, and that year my younger sister was bringing her new boyfriend to meet everyone. I remember feeling that good kind of tired, the one that comes from a productive day when you know the finish line is close. My phone buzzed at 8:47 with a new delivery request, and my first instinct was to swipe it away without reading it. But my thumb hovered there for a second, and I made the mistake of checking the details. The pickup location was a storage facility on the east side, already 15 minutes in the wrong direction from where I needed to be. What stopped me from declining right away was the payout. $80 for a single delivery, almost triple what I would normally get for that distance. The customer note explained it was a last-minute gift that had to arrive before midnight, and they were willing to pay extra for someone willing to work on a holiday. I sat in my parked car outside a Wendy's, engine running, doing the math in my head. $80 meant a full tank of gas plus some left over. My mom would understand an extra hour. I tapped accept at 8:51, and the app loaded the pickup code along with the destination address. A street called Thornberry Lane out in Westerville. I knew the area from previous jobs, one of those neighborhoods with big lawns and houses that all looked like they belonged in a catalog. Nice people, good tippers, the kind of customers who never gave you problems. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed east toward the storage place, already planning how I would explain the delay to my family. The storage facility was one of those 24-hour access places with a keypad at the gate and rows of orange metal doors under fluorescent lights. I punched in the code the app gave me, and the gate rattled open slow enough to test my patience. Unit 117 was near the back, tucked in a corner where the overhead lights flickered every few seconds. When I unlocked it with the second code, I found exactly what the job description said. A single cardboard box, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, sitting alone on the concrete floor of an otherwise empty unit. No labels on the box, no company logo, no return address. Just plain brown cardboard sealed with clear packing tape. It was lighter than I expected when I picked it up, maybe 5 or 6 pounds at most. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would rent a whole storage unit just for one box. But people do weird things, and I'd learned not to ask questions. I loaded it into my back seat, locked up the unit, and got back on the road by 9:20. Thornberry Lane turned out to be about 25 minutes from the storage place, and I spent most of the drive listening to a podcast about unsolved disappearances. Kind of ironic now that I think about it. The neighborhood was exactly how I remembered it, quiet and clean and decorated for the season. Wreaths on doors, lights wrapped around porch columns, inflatable snowmen glowing in front yards. The house I needed was number 4127, a 2-story colonial-style place with dark green shutters and a circular driveway. What caught my attention first was that all the lights were off. Not just dim, but completely dark. No Christmas lights outside, no glow from the windows, nothing. Every other house on the block was lit up like a postcard, but this one looked like nobody was home. I pulled into the driveway at 9:48, and the app automatically logged my arrival time along with my GPS coordinates. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. I grabbed the box from the back seat and walked up to the front door, my breath visible in the cold air. I rang the doorbell and waited. Nothing. I could hear the chime echo inside the house, a 2-tone sound that seemed louder than it should have been in all that silence. After maybe 30 seconds, I knocked 3 times on the door. Firm knocks, the kind that would wake someone up if they were sleeping. Still nothing. The delivery instructions on the app said to leave the package on the porch if no one answered, which was common enough for this kind of job. But something made me hesitate before I just dropped it and left. The front door had a narrow window panel on the right side, frosted glass with a decorative pattern, and I leaned in close to see if I could make out any movement inside. What I saw was just darkness and vague shapes of furniture in what looked like a living room. No Christmas tree, which struck me as odd for a family home on that night. I stepped back and looked at the windows on the second floor, and that is when I noticed one of them was open about 6 inches. Not a lot, but enough to be strange on a night when the temperature was below freezing. I stood there on the porch for probably a full minute, trying to decide what to do. The open window bothered me, but it was not really my business. People forget things, leave windows cracked for ventilation, whatever. My job was to deliver a package, not to investigate why someone's house looked abandoned on the one night when every other family was home together. I set the box down on the porch right next to the door. took a photo with my phone for the delivery confirmation, and walked back to my car. The app required me to take a picture of where I left the package, and looking at that photo now still makes my chest tight. You can see the box sitting there, the dark door behind it, and if you look at the bottom right corner of the frame, there is a reflection in the glass panel. Just a smear of something pale that I did not notice at the time. I finished the delivery at 9:52, got in my car and drove away thinking about nothing except getting to my mom's house before the food got cold. The next few days were normal holiday stuff. Christmas morning with my family, leftovers for lunch, visiting my aunt on the 26th, catching up on sleep. I worked a short warehouse shift on December 27th and did a couple more deliveries that evening. Nothing memorable. Life just kept moving the way it does. It was December 29th when everything changed, and I remember the exact moment because I was eating cereal at my kitchen table and scrolling through my phone. A local news headline popped up on my feed, something about a family found dead in Westerville. I almost scrolled past it, the way you do with most bad news that does not involve you directly. But then I saw the street name, Thornberry Lane, and I stopped chewing. The article said police had discovered the bodies of 3 people inside a home after a relative called in a welfare check: a man, a woman, and their teenage daughter. The house number was not in the article, but there was a photograph taken from the street, and I recognized those dark green shutters immediately. I recognized the circular driveway where I had parked my car 5 nights earlier. I put my phone down and just sat there for a while trying to process what I was reading. The article did not give many details about what happened inside that house, just that police were treating it as a homicide investigation, and that the medical examiner was working to establish a timeline. But there was one line that made me feel like all the air had left the room. Authorities believed the family had been dead for several days before they were found, possibly since the evening of December 24th. I grabbed my phone again and opened the delivery app, scrolling back through my completed jobs until I found it. December 24th, 9:48 arrival, 9:52 completion, 4127 Thornberry Lane. The timestamp placed me at that house on the same night the family was last seen alive. I had been standing on that porch ringing that doorbell, knocking on that door, while something terrible had either just happened or was still happening inside. The thought made me push my cereal bowl away because I suddenly felt like I might throw up. I spent the next hour going through every news article I could find about the case, but details were scarce. The family's name was Hartman, Glenn Hartman, his wife Melissa, and their 15-year-old daughter Caitlin. Neighbors described them as quiet and friendly, the kind of people who always waved but kept to themselves. No one had seen anything suspicious, no one had heard anything unusual. The welfare check had been requested by Melissa's sister in Pennsylvania, who got worried when no one answered calls or texts for days. That was all the news had to offer. I kept thinking about that open window on the 2nd floor, how strange it seemed at the time, how I had talked myself out of caring about it. And then I remembered the photo, the delivery confirmation photo I had taken of the package on the porch. I opened my camera roll and found it, December 24th at 9:52 in the evening. The box sitting there, the dark door, and in that narrow glass panel to the right, that pale smear I had dismissed as nothing. I zoomed in as far as my phone would allow, and my whole body went cold. It was a face, blurry and distorted by the frosted glass, but unmistakably a face pressed against the window from inside, looking out at me. For a long time I just stared at that image, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. Maybe it was a reflection of something outside. Maybe it was a curtain or a piece of furniture that happened to look like features in the low light. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. There were eyes, a nose, the shape of a mouth. Someone had been standing right there on the other side of that door while I knocked, while I waited, while I set down the package and took this picture. They had watched me walk back to my car and drive away. I did not know if it was one of the family members, still alive at that point, and unable to call for help, or if it was whoever had killed them. Both possibilities made me sick in different ways. I knew I had to call the police, but I also knew what that meant. I would have to explain why I was there, show them my delivery records, hand over this photo. My timestamp put me at a crime scene. My face might end up on the news as a person of interest. But I could not live with keeping this to myself, so I found the number for the Westerville Police Department and made the call that would change everything about the next few months of my life. The detectives interviewed me 3 separate times over the following weeks. They took my phone, examined the photo, pulled all my delivery records and GPS data from that night. For about 2 weeks, I was genuinely afraid they considered me a suspect, even though my timeline showed I was only at the house for 4 minutes. They asked me the same questions over and over. Did I see anyone else on the street? Did I hear anything from inside? Did I notice any vehicles parked nearby? I told them everything I could remember, which was not much. The dark house, the open window, the silence when I knocked. They never told me directly what happened to the Hartman family, but I pieced together enough from news reports and the questions they asked. It was bad. The kind of bad that makes you understand why some details never get released to the public. What I do know is that the medical examiner placed the time of death somewhere between 7 and 10 in the evening on December 24th, which means whoever was behind that glass door when I took that photo could have been the last person to see the family alive, or the first to see them dead. The detectives enhanced the image from my phone, but the frosted glass made it impossible to identify any features. Just a shape. Just proof that someone was there, watching me, breathing on the other side of that door while I stood 3 feet away. The case is still open. That is what the detective told me the last time we spoke, about 8 months after my initial call. No arrests, no named suspects, no clear motive. The storage unit where I picked up the package had been rented under a fake name with a prepaid card, and the delivery request came through a burner account that was deleted within hours of my completion. Whoever ordered that delivery wanted someone, anyone, to show up at that house on that specific night and leave a digital trail. I still do not understand why. Maybe they wanted a witness who could establish that the family was already gone by a certain time. Maybe they wanted someone else's GPS data at the scene to confuse the investigation. Maybe I will never know. The box I delivered was empty when police recovered it from the porch, just cardboard and tape and nothing inside. I think about that night more often than I should, especially around the holidays. I think about how I almost declined that job, how $80 seemed worth the detour, how I stood on that porch and felt something was wrong but walked away anyway. And I think about that face in the glass, those eyes looking out at me from the darkness, and I wonder if they were pleading for help or making sure I left. I will probably wonder that for the rest of my life. Cold snaps in rural Ohio are nothing new, but January of 2018 brought something different. For 3 straight weeks, the temperature never climbed above 15 degrees, and the local news kept running stories about burst pipes, stranded motorists, and elderly folks found frozen in their own homes because they could not afford heating oil. I was renting a 1-bedroom place on Birchwood Lane at the time, still paying off student loans from a nursing degree I had finished just 2 years earlier. My 24th birthday had come and gone quietly that month, celebrated with a frozen pizza and a phone call from my mom who lived 6 hours away in Pennsylvania. When a coworker shared a Facebook post about a charity called Heartland Winter Aid, looking for volunteers to pick up donated supplies, I signed up without thinking twice. The post looked legitimate, professional logo, phone numbers, a mission statement about helping families survive the cold. They needed people with vehicles to collect surplus food and blankets from rural drop-off points and bring them to a distribution center in town. I woke up on that Saturday to a sky the color of old concrete and a text message confirming my volunteer assignment. The drop-off location was a decommissioned feed mill, about 35 minutes outside of Millbrook, down a series of back roads I had never driven before. The directions came in an email attachment, no Google Maps link, just written instructions telling me to take County Road 47 until I passed a rusted water tower, then turn right onto an unpaved road and continue for roughly 3 miles. I printed the directions because cell service out there was notoriously unreliable, and I did not want to get lost in the middle of nowhere with my gas tank running low. My Subaru started on the third try that morning, the engine groaning against the cold, and I let it warm up while I scraped a thick layer of frost from the windshield. By 9:30 I was heading out of town, passing gas stations and fast food joints that gradually gave way to farmland. Endless white fields dotted with skeletal trees and the occasional barn hunched against the wind. The further I drove, the more isolated everything became. I passed a farmhouse with no lights on, then another with a collapsed roof, then nothing but fence posts and frozen ditches for what felt like miles. The rusted water tower appeared right where the directions said it would, a hulking brown cylinder rising from the flat landscape like some kind of forgotten monument. I turned right onto the unpaved road and immediately felt my tires struggle for traction on the frozen gravel. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle, bordered on both sides by dense thickets of bare branches that scraped against my windows as I crept forward. I checked my phone and saw exactly what I had expected. No signal, not even a single bar. A small knot of unease formed somewhere in my chest, but I told myself I was being paranoid. This was a charity pickup, nothing more. Plenty of rural locations had poor reception. I kept driving, counting the miles on my odometer, watching for the old feed mill with the faded red siding that the email had described. I spotted the building at exactly the 3-mile mark, just like the directions promised. It sat at the end of the road in a clearing surrounded by overgrown brush and rusted farm equipment, half buried in snow. The structure was larger than I had imagined. A main warehouse with a peaked metal roof and 2 smaller outbuildings flanking it on either side. The red paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing gray wood beneath, and several windows on the upper level were shattered or missing entirely. 2 pickup trucks were already parked near the main entrance, both of them newer models that seemed out of place against the decay of everything else. I pulled up beside them and shut off my engine, scanning the area for any sign of other volunteers or the donation boxes I was supposed to collect. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of my cooling engine and the faint whistle of wind through the broken windows above. I sat there for a long moment, hands still on the steering wheel, waiting for someone to emerge from the building and wave me over. After about 2 minutes of nothing, I decided to get out and look around. The cold hit me like a wall the second I opened my door, that deep, biting January cold that makes your lungs ache with every breath. I zipped my coat up to my chin and walked toward the main entrance, my boots crunching on frozen gravel. The warehouse door was a massive sliding thing made of corrugated metal, rusted at the edges and hanging slightly crooked on its track. It stood open about 3 feet, just enough for a person to slip through. I called out a hello and my voice echoed back at me from somewhere inside, flat and hollow. No response came. I was about to call out again when I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to find 2 men walking toward me from the direction of the smaller outbuilding on the left. They moved with a casual slowness that made me uneasy, their hands stuffed into the pockets of heavy work jackets. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick brown beard and a camouflage hunting cap pulled low over his forehead. The other was shorter, wiry, with pale skin and a shaved head that made his ears look too large for his face. The bearded one spoke first, his voice carrying across the frozen air between us. He asked if I was the volunteer, and I said yes, that I was here to pick up the donation boxes for Heartland Winter Aid. Something shifted in his expression when I said that. A flicker of amusement, maybe, or recognition. The shorter one had circled around to my right, positioning himself between me and my car in a way that seemed deliberate. I felt a pulse of alarm shoot through my body, a primal warning signal that I tried to ignore. The bearded man told me there had been a change of plans, that the donations were being stored in the back building, and I would need to help them load everything. He gestured toward the outbuilding behind him, the one with no windows and a padlock hanging open on its door. I told him I would just pull my car around to make loading easier. But when I turned to walk back to my Subaru, the shorter man was already standing beside the driver's side door, his hand resting on the handle. He smiled at me, a thin and joyless thing that never reached his eyes, and said there was no need for that. That was when everything changed. The bearded man dropped all pretense of friendliness and told me I had made a mistake coming here. He said people like me were always trying to steal from them, showing up to take what did not belong to them. I tried to explain that I was just a volunteer, that someone from the charity had sent me, but my words seemed to bounce off him without making any impact. His voice got louder, angrier, accusing me of being part of some scheme to rob them of their donations. None of it made sense. There were no donations here, no boxes, no supplies, nothing but abandoned buildings and frozen dirt. The shorter man had pulled something from his pocket, and when I glanced over I saw it was a knife with a black handle and a blade about 4 inches long. He was not pointing it at me, just holding it loosely at his side, but the message was clear enough. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I raised my hand slowly and told them I did not want any trouble, that I would leave right now and never come back, that I would forget I ever saw this place. The bearded man stepped closer, close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket and see the broken capillaries in his nose. He asked me where my phone was, and I lied without thinking, said I had left it at home. He did not believe me. He told the shorter one to check my pockets, and before I could react, the wiry man was behind me, his free hand digging into my coat while the knife stayed visible in the other. He found my phone in my inside pocket and tossed it to the bearded man, who caught it and immediately powered it off. Then he asked about my purse, my wallet, anything else of value. I told him my purse was in the car, on the passenger seat, and he sent the shorter man to retrieve it. I stood there in the freezing cold, my breath coming in short white puffs, watching a stranger rifle through my belongings. He pulled out my wallet, counted the $43 I had inside, and pocketed the cash along with my debit card. He found my keys too, the ones I had stupidly left in the center console, and he held them up with a look that made my insides turn to water. The bearded man told me to start walking toward the windowless outbuilding. I did not move. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that if I went inside that building, I would never come out. I told him no, that he could take my car, take everything, but I was not going in there. For a moment, he just stared at me like he was deciding something. Then the shorter man moved, quick as a snake, and I felt the cold edge of the blade press against the side of my neck. Not cutting, just resting there, a promise of what could happen. The bearded man leaned in close and said that I could walk on my own 2 feet, or they could drag me. Those were my options. My legs started moving before my brain had fully processed the threat, carrying me toward that building, like they belonged to someone else. The shorter man stayed right behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, while the bearded one walked ahead to push open the heavy wooden door. Inside was darkness, and a smell that hit me before my eyes could adjust. Something rotten and chemical, like old meat mixed with gasoline. They shoved me inside and the door slammed shut behind me. For a few seconds I could not see anything at all, just black emptiness pressing in from every direction. Then the bearded man switched on a flashlight and I saw where they had brought me. The outbuilding was maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, with a concrete floor stained dark in patches and bare wooden walls covered in water damage and mold. In one corner sat a metal folding chair with duct tape wrapped around the armrests. In another corner was a pile of what looked like clothing, coats, scarves, a single snow boot lying on its side. Along the back wall, someone had stacked plastic bins and cardboard boxes, and I noticed several purses and backpacks piled near them. My mind was trying to process what I was seeing, trying to make sense of all these belongings that clearly did not belong to the 2 men holding me captive. That was when the bearded man told me to sit in the chair, and something in his voice made it clear this was not a request. I do not know what would have happened next if the sound had not come. A car engine, distant but getting closer, rumbling down the gravel road toward the property. Both men went rigid, exchanging a look that told me this was not part of their plan. The bearded one swore under his breath and told the shorter man to go check to see who it was and get rid of them. The shorter man hesitated, glancing at me, and the bearded one snapped at him to move. Once the door opened and closed again, I was alone with the bearded man in that dark building. He had set the flashlight down on one of the boxes, pointing it at the ceiling so it cast a dim glow across everything. His attention was split between me and the door, listening for sounds from outside. I heard voices, the shorter man talking to someone, a woman's voice responding. Another volunteer, maybe, or someone who had gotten lost. Either way, she had no idea what she was walking into. The bearded man muttered something about complications and stepped toward the door, keeping one eye on me. That was when I noticed he had set my car keys down on top of a plastic bin, right next to the flashlight, maybe 3 feet away from where I stood. I did not think. I just moved. My hand closed around those keys and I was running before my brain caught up with my body, sprinting toward a section of the wall where I had noticed the wood looked rotten and weak. I hit it shoulder first with everything I had, and the boards gave way in an explosion of splinters and frozen air. I heard the bearded man shout behind me, but I did not stop, did not look back. I was outside, in the blinding white daylight, my lungs burning as I ran through snow that came up past my ankles. I could see another car parked near the trucks, a green Ford Explorer with a woman standing beside it, looking confused, while the shorter man talked to her with his hands spread wide in a calming gesture. I screamed at her to run, to get in her car and go. She looked at me, saw my face, and something in my expression must have registered because she scrambled for her door. The shorter man lunged at her, but she was already inside, locking the doors. I changed direction and ran for my own car, jamming the key into the ignition with fingers that felt like they belonged to a stranger. The engine turned over on the first try, which felt like some kind of miracle. I threw it into reverse and floored the gas, tires spinning on ice before catching gravel. The bearded man had come around the side of the outbuilding, moving fast, but I was already pulling away. In my rearview mirror, I saw the woman in the Explorer doing the same thing, her tires kicking up a spray of frozen dirt as she reversed toward the road. We both flew down that narrow path through the thicket, branches scraping metal, and I did not slow down until I hit County Road 47. I drove straight to the sheriff's office in Millbrook, shaking so hard I could barely keep the wheel steady. The woman in the Explorer followed me the whole way. Her name was Candace, and she had received the same Facebook message about volunteering for Heartland Winter Aid. She had been assigned to that same location, scheduled to arrive 15 minutes after me. When the deputies finally made it out to the feed mill that afternoon, the 2 men were gone. But they found the outbuilding, and they found what was inside. The belongings of at least 9 different people. Identification cards and wallets and phones, some of them belonging to individuals who had been reported missing over the past 2 winters. The investigation took months. I learned that the fake charity had been operating under different names for at least 3 years, targeting people during cold snaps, when desperation made folks more willing to help and less likely to ask questions. They found similar setups at 2 other rural locations in neighboring counties, all connected to the same pair of men. The bearded one turned out to be named Vernon Dunlap, and he had a record stretching back 15 years, assault, robbery, and a manslaughter charge that got pleaded down to nothing. They caught him in March, trying to cross into Indiana with a trunk full of stolen electronics and cash. The shorter one, whose name I never learned, disappeared completely and has not been seen since. 3 bodies were eventually recovered from a property Dunlap had access to, buried in shallow graves behind a barn. The victims were all people who had responded to those fake charity posts, people who just wanted to help their neighbors survive the cold. I still think about that pile of coats in the corner of that outbuilding. I think about the single snow boot lying on its side. I think about how close I came to becoming another name on a missing persons report that nobody would ever solve. And I think about Candace, whose timing saved both our lives, and how neither of us has volunteered for anything since. Nobody in my family talks about what happened at Bridget's house anymore. If you bring it up, they change the subject. If you push, they get angry. And if you keep pushing, they look at you with this expression that I can only describe as a warning. Like you're about to break something that took a lot of effort to hold together. I'm writing this because it's been 3 years, and I still wake up sometimes at night thinking about that evening, going over every detail, wondering if I could have done something different. My cousin Bridget had been hosting our family gatherings since she inherited Grandma's farmhouse outside of Toledo, and every December 24th, we would all drive in from different parts of Ohio to spend the night together. I had just finished my teaching certification that fall, finally done with student loans and night classes, and my girlfriend Nina was visiting her own family in Portland. So I made the 3-hour drive from Columbus alone, feeling good about life for the first time in years. When I pulled into the gravel driveway around 4 in the afternoon, I counted 7 cars already lined up along the wooden fence. Everyone had arrived early. The farmhouse looked the way it always did. White lights on the porch, a wreath on the door, smoke curling from the chimney. I grabbed my bag of presents and walked up the steps, already hearing voices and laughter from inside. But when Bridget opened the front door, her face made me stop mid-step. She smiled and said my name and hugged me, but her eyes kept moving past me, checking something behind her. She had lost weight since Thanksgiving, and no amount of concealer could hide the dark circles under her eyes. Before I could ask if she was okay, her husband Oliver appeared at her side and put his hand on her shoulder. She flinched, just for a second, barely visible. And then Oliver was shaking my hand, taking my coat, telling me how glad they were I could make it. I walked into the living room where my uncles were arguing about football, and I pushed that small moment out of my mind. The first couple of hours went the way they always did. My Aunt Francine was in the kitchen with my mom, both of them fussing over the ham and the green bean casserole. The kids, my cousin's 2 boys and my uncle's daughter, were running through the house playing some game that involved a lot of screaming. I sat on the couch with a beer and caught up with my Uncle Ray, who told me about his knee surgery and his new truck in equal detail. Every now and then I would glance toward the kitchen, where Bridget was helping with the food, and I noticed that Oliver was never far from her. He would walk past the doorway, check on her, walk back to the living room. At one point, I saw him lean in close and whisper something in her ear, and she nodded quickly, her shoulders tense. When she came out to refill the chip bowls, her smile was stretched so tight it looked painful. I caught her eye and mouthed, "You okay?" But she just gave me a thumbs up and disappeared back into the kitchen. Around 6, we all gathered in the dining room for dinner. Bridget and Oliver sat at one end of the long table, my parents at the other, and the rest of us filled in the middle. The food was good, the wine was flowing, and for a while everything seemed normal. But I started noticing things, small things. The way Bridget asked Oliver before taking a second glass of wine, not out loud, just a quick glance waiting for his nod. The way she kept apologizing for things that didn't need apologies, like the rolls being slightly overdone or the gravy being too thick. And twice during the meal, Oliver corrected her when she was telling a story. Not in a joking way, but flat and cold, like a teacher correcting a student. "That's not how it happened," he said both times, and both times Bridget went quiet and let him finish the story his way. My mom caught my eye across the table, and I could tell she had noticed it too. But neither of us said anything. We just kept eating. After dinner, the men moved to the living room to watch a game while the women cleaned up. I know how that sounds, but that's how it always was at these gatherings, old habits from a different generation. I offered to help in the kitchen, but my Aunt Francine waved me off and told me to go relax. So I grabbed another beer and sat in the corner armchair, half watching the TV while my uncles yelled at the screen. That's when I heard it. Voices from the hallway, low and sharp. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the tone. It was Oliver and Bridget, and whatever they were discussing, it wasn't friendly. I got up to use the bathroom, which meant walking past the hallway that led to the back bedrooms. As I got closer, I could hear them more clearly. Oliver was saying something about her making him look stupid at dinner, and Bridget was apologizing, her voice small and pleading. I stopped walking. I should have kept going, should have pretended I didn't hear, but I just stood there. Then Oliver said something I couldn't catch, and Bridget started crying, quiet, muffled sobs like she was covering her mouth. I took a step toward them, but before I could do anything, my Aunt Francine appeared out of nowhere and grabbed my arm. She pulled me back toward the living room with a grip that surprised me. When I tried to say something about what I'd heard, she cut me off. "Leave it alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is between them. No one is ruining Christmas." I stared at her, not sure I had heard her right. Bridget was crying in the back of the house, clearly upset, and my aunt was telling me to ignore it? I tried to argue, but Francine's expression stopped me. It wasn't angry, it was scared. She looked like someone trying to keep a lid on a pot that was about to boil over, and she was terrified of what would happen if she failed. "Please," she said, "just go sit down. Bridget will be fine. She always is." I wanted to push past her, wanted to march down that hallway and ask Oliver what the hell he thought he was doing. But I didn't. I let my aunt guide me back to the living room, and I sat down in that armchair, and I watched the game without seeing a single play. 10 minutes later, Bridget came out with a fresh tray of cookies, her makeup touched up, her smile back in place. Nobody said a word. The night went on. We did the gift exchange around 8. Everyone gathered around the tree while the kids tore through wrapping paper. I gave Bridget a scarf I had picked out at a craft fair in Columbus, and when she opened it, her eyes got wet for just a second before she blinked it away and thanked me. Oliver watched her the whole time, his arm draped over the back of her chair in a way that looked possessive rather than affectionate. I noticed that Bridget didn't give Oliver a gift, or if she did, he didn't open it in front of everyone. After the presents, my Uncle Ray suggested we play cards like we used to when Grandma was alive. We set up at the dining room table, me, Ray, my dad, and my cousin's husband Neil, while the others stayed in the living room with the kids. Oliver said he was going to help Bridget clean up the gift wrap, and the two of them disappeared down the hallway toward the bedrooms. I tried to focus on the game, but I kept glancing toward that hallway, waiting for them to come back. 15 minutes passed, then 20. My dad asked if I was going to play my hand or just stare at the wall, and I forced myself to pay attention. That's when we heard the crash. It came from somewhere in the back of the house, a heavy muffled thud followed by the sound of something breaking, glass maybe, or ceramic. Everyone in the living room went quiet. The kids stopped playing. My mom and Aunt Francine exchanged a look that I will never forget. Not surprise, not confusion, just grim recognition, like this was something they had been expecting all night. Before anyone could move, my Uncle Ray stood up from the card table and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I'll handle it." He walked down the hallway, and a few seconds later I heard a door open in Ray's voice, calm but firm. I couldn't make out the words. Then another voice, Oliver's, sharp and defensive. Then nothing. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes. When Ray finally came back, his face was red and he was breathing hard, but his expression was carefully neutral. "Everything's fine," he said. "Bridget dropped a lamp, no big deal." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each of us in turn. No one is ruining Christmas. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up from the card table and said I needed to use the bathroom. My dad grabbed my wrist and told me to use the one by the kitchen, not the one down the hall. The way he said it, the firmness in his grip, told me everything I needed to know. Something bad had happened in that back room, and my own father was trying to keep me from seeing it. I pulled my arm free and told him I would be right back. The hallway was dark except for a thin strip of light coming from under one of the bedroom doors. As I got closer, I could hear Bridget's voice, not crying this time, just quiet, almost monotone, like she was reciting something she had memorized. I knocked softly and said her name. The talking stopped. A few seconds later, the door opened just a crack, and Bridget's face appeared in the gap. She had changed her shirt, I noticed. The cream-colored blouse from dinner was gone, replaced by a dark sweater with a high neck. And there was something on her cheek, a red mark, fresh, the shape of fingers. She saw me looking and turned her head so the mark was in shadow. She told me she was fine, that she just needed a minute, that I should go back to the party. Her voice was flat and empty, like someone reading lines from a script. I asked her where Oliver was, and she said he had gone outside to cool off. I asked her what really happened, and for just a second something flickered in her eyes. Fear, exhaustion. maybe a desperate wish that someone would finally see what was happening. But then it was gone, and she smiled that awful stretched smile and said it was nothing. Just a silly argument, no big deal. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I turned and saw my mother standing at the end of the hallway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable in the dim light. "Come back to the living room," she said. It wasn't a request. Bridget needs some time alone. No one is ruining Christmas. 3 times now. 3 different people. The same exact words. I looked back at Bridget, hoping she would say something, ask for help, give me any sign that I should stay. But she just nodded and closed the door in my face. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Oliver came back inside around 10, his face calm, his hands in his pockets, acting like nothing had happened. He sat down on the couch next to my Uncle Ray, and within minutes they were laughing about something on TV. Bridget eventually emerged from the bedroom wearing fresh makeup that almost hid the swelling on her cheek, and she busied herself making hot chocolate for the kids. I watched her move through the kitchen, watched the way she avoided looking at Oliver, watched the way everyone else avoided looking at her. It was like witnessing a play where all the actors knew their lines perfectly, where every movement was choreographed to maintain the illusion that everything was normal. Around 11, people started heading to bed. The farmhouse had 4 bedrooms, so we doubled up the way we always did. Kids in sleeping bags in the living room, couples in the guest rooms, singles like me on air mattresses wherever we could find space. I set up my mattress in the upstairs hallway near the bathroom and lay there in the dark listening to the house settle. I could hear murmured voices from behind closed doors, but I couldn't make out words. At some point I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is waking up to gray morning light and the sound of my Aunt Francine screaming. I ran downstairs still half asleep, my heart pounding, not sure what I was about to find. Francine was standing in the kitchen doorway, her hand over her mouth, staring at something I couldn't see. My parents were already there, and my Uncle Ray and Neil, all of them crowded around the kitchen entrance with expressions I had never seen before. I pushed past them and looked inside. The kitchen was empty. The back door was wide open, letting in cold December air, and there were drops of something dark on the floor leading from the hallway to the door. On the counter, next to the coffee maker, was Bridget's wedding ring, just sitting there, placed carefully on a folded napkin, like she had taken it off to wash dishes and never put it back on. Oliver was sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were red, but his face was blank. "She left," he said. "Sometime in the night. I woke up and she was gone." He gestured at the open door, the drops on the floor, the ring on the counter. "She just left." I wanted to call the police right then. I said we should call someone, that this didn't make sense, that Bridget wouldn't just walk out into the cold in the middle of the night without her car, without her phone, without telling anyone. But before I could finish, my Uncle Ray put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed hard enough to hurt. "She's been unhappy for a while," he said, his voice steady and rehearsed. "She mentioned wanting to get away, start fresh somewhere." This isn't a surprise to anyone who's been paying attention. I looked around the room, waiting for someone to disagree, waiting for my mom or my aunt or anyone to say that this was insane, that we needed to do something, but they all just stood there nodding, their faces arranged in expressions of sad acceptance. My Aunt Francine wiped her eyes and said that Bridget had talked to her about leaving Oliver, about needing space, about wanting to disappear for a while. My dad said we should respect her wishes and give her time. Oliver sat at the table, silent, his hands folded in front of him, and I swear I saw something like relief flicker across his face before he buried it under a mask of grief. By noon, everyone had agreed on the story. Bridget had been struggling, Bridget had left voluntarily, Bridget would reach out when she was ready. No one called the police. No one called her friends. No one did anything except pack up their cars and drive home like it was any other Christmas morning. I think about those drops on the kitchen floor all the time. I think about the ring on the napkin, placed so carefully, so deliberately, like someone wanted us to find it and draw a specific conclusion. I think about the mark on Bridget's face, the shape of fingers, and the way she flinched every time Oliver touched her. I think about how everyone in that house heard the crash, saw her change her clothes, watched her cover her bruises with makeup, and still chose to believe she simply walked away. 3 years now, and Bridget has never contacted anyone. No phone calls, no emails, no letters. Her social media went dark that night and never came back. Oliver sold the farmhouse 6 months later and moved somewhere down south. When I ask my family about it, they get angry. Tell me to let it go, remind me that Bridget made her choice and we need to respect it. No one ruined Christmas, my mother said to me last year, her voice cold. And no one is going to ruin it now by digging up the past. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know that somewhere in that house, while we all slept and pretended everything was fine, something happened to my cousin that nobody wants to admit. I don't have proof. I don't have answers. I just have this sick feeling in my stomach that has never gone away, and the family that looks at me like a threat every time I open my mouth. Whatever happened to Bridget that night, the truth walked out the back door with her, and everyone I loved decided a long time ago that finding it would be worse than never knowing at all. Christmas was 5 days away, and my apartment smelled like coffee and regret. After my divorce finalized that October, I moved into a one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of Birchwood Commons, a bland complex in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. My graduating class from high school had their 15-year reunion that fall, and while scrolling through photos of former classmates with their families in vacation homes, I sat surrounded by boxes I still had not unpacked. The job at the insurance company paid enough to cover rent and utilities, but not much else. I kept the thermostat at 62 degrees to save money. That particular morning, December 20th, I woke up around 7 to the sound of my upstairs neighbor's television blaring some talk show. I made my usual pot of cheap coffee, the kind that comes in a massive red canister, and shuffled toward the kitchen table where I normally ate my toast while doom-scrolling through news on my phone. That was when I saw it. A white envelope sat in the middle of my living room floor, maybe 8 feet from the front door. It looked thick, stuffed with something substantial. My first thought was that it must have slipped under the door, some kind of late rent notice or holiday flyer from management. But when I picked it up, the weight told me immediately this was not paper. I tore open the unsealed flap, and my breath caught somewhere in my chest. Cash. Stacks of it bound with rubber bands, all 20s and 50s from what I could see. I counted it 3 times because my brain refused to accept the number. $14,600. There was no note, no card, no name. Nothing to indicate where this came from or who left it. I checked the envelope again, flipping it inside out. Completely blank. I walked to my front door and examined the lock, the frame, the deadbolt. Everything looked normal, untouched. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had locked that door before going to bed. I sat on my couch for almost an hour, just staring at the money spread across my coffee table. My mind cycled through every possible explanation. Maybe my mother sent it, feeling guilty about the divorce, wanting to help me get back on my feet. But my mother worked as a receptionist at a dental office and could barely cover her own mortgage. My father had been out of the picture since I was 11. My ex-wife, Melanie, certainly was not sending me anything except passive-aggressive texts about picking up the rest of my stuff from her garage. I thought about my co-workers, my neighbors, anyone who might have access to my building. None of it made sense. People do not just give away $14,000 anonymously, and they definitely do not break into apartments to do it. I picked up one of the stacks and examined the bills closely. They looked real, felt real, had that distinct papery smell that money carries. No obvious counterfeits, no die packs, just clean, unmarked cash sitting in my living room like it belonged there. Around 9:30, I decided to check if anything else in my apartment had been disturbed. I walked through every room, opened every closet, looked under the bed like a kid checking for monsters. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. My laptop still sat on the kitchen counter. The $40 in my wallet remained untouched. Whoever came in had left something instead of taking anything, which made the whole situation even more unsettling. I checked the windows next. all of them locked from the inside, painted shut years ago by some lazy maintenance worker. The only entry point was the front door, and I lived on the 3rd floor with no fire escape nearby. I called the building management office, but nobody answered, probably because of the holidays. I left a voicemail asking if anyone had reported issues with locks or unauthorized entry. Then I did something that, looking back, I probably should not have done. I put the money in a shoebox, shoved it to the back of my bedroom closet, and told myself I would figure it out later. I needed to go to work. The office was nearly empty that day, just a skeleton crew processing end-of-year claims before the holiday break. I sat at my cubicle pretending to focus on spreadsheets while my mind kept drifting back to that envelope. During my lunch break, I drove to a sandwich shop a few blocks away, and that was when I first heard about it. The television mounted in the corner was tuned to a local news channel, and the anchor was talking about a home invasion that had occurred overnight in Westerville, a neighborhood maybe 20 minutes from my apartment. An elderly couple, Franklin and Dorothy Weiss, had been attacked in their home around 2 in the morning. Franklin was in critical condition at a nearby hospital. Dorothy had died at the scene. The attacker had stolen an undisclosed amount of cash that the couple reportedly kept in a safe. Police were searching for a white male, medium build, last seen driving a dark-colored pickup truck. I remember standing there with my turkey club halfway to my mouth, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. The amount of cash was undisclosed, the reporter said. Undisclosed. I drove back to the office with the radio off, my thoughts spiraling into dark territory. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Columbus was a big city, and crimes happened every day. The money in my closet could have come from anywhere, from anyone. Maybe some eccentric millionaire was playing Santa Claus in my building. Maybe a drug dealer got the wrong apartment. Maybe I was losing my mind and had somehow forgotten a savings account I did not know I had. But none of those explanations felt right, and the timing was impossible to ignore. Someone breaks into an elderly couple's home, steals their cash, kills a woman, and on that same night, thousands of dollars mysteriously appear in my locked apartment. I spent the rest of the afternoon watching the clock, refreshing news articles on my phone under my desk, waiting for more details. By 4 o'clock, the police had released additional information. The stolen amount was estimated to be between $15,000 and $20,000. The safe had been cracked open with tools. Franklin Weiss remained unconscious and could not provide a description of the attacker. I felt sick. I left work early, claiming a headache, which was not entirely a lie. The drive home took longer than usual because my mind kept wandering, and I missed 2 turns. When I finally pulled into the parking lot at Birchwood Commons, I sat in my car for 10 minutes, just staring at the building. What was I supposed to do? Walk into a police station and hand over $14,000, explaining that it magically appeared in my apartment the same night an old woman was murdered for her cash? They would think I was involved. They would have to. No jury in the world would believe that kind of coincidence. And if I kept the money, I was what? An accessory after the fact? Harboring stolen property? I had no idea what the legal terms were, but I knew none of them were good. I finally forced myself to get out of the car and walk toward the entrance. That was when I noticed the pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot, near the dumpsters. Dark blue, maybe black, hard to tell in the fading afternoon light. It had not been there that morning. I told myself it meant nothing. Lots of people drove pickup trucks. I walked a little faster anyway. Inside my apartment, everything looked exactly as I had left it. I went straight to the bedroom closet, pulled out the shoebox, and counted the money again. Still $14,600. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding a stack of 20s, and tried to think clearly. Someone had put this money here on purpose. Someone who knew where I lived. Someone who could get past a locked door without leaving a trace. But why me? I was nobody. A divorced claims adjuster with bad credit and no connections to anything illegal. I had never even gotten a speeding ticket. None of this made any sense unless the person who left the money made a mistake. Unless they thought this apartment belonged to someone else. Or unless they needed a place to hide it temporarily and planned to come back. That thought hit me like a punch to the chest. I stood up quickly, shoved the shoebox back into the closet, and grabbed the baseball bat I kept next to my nightstand. Then I heard it. A soft knock at my front door, 3 slow taps, almost polite. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was 6:47 in the evening. I approached the door without making a sound, gripping the bat so tight my knuckles ached. There was no peephole, one of many things I had complained about when I moved in and then promptly forgotten. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting for something else to happen. Another knock came, same pattern, 3 slow taps. Then a voice, male, calm, almost friendly. "I know you found it." That was all he said. "I know you found it." I pressed my back against the wall next to the door, my heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it from the hallway. I did not respond, did not move, just stood there clutching that bat like it could save me from whatever was on the other side. A full minute passed in silence. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away from my door and down the corridor toward the stairwell. I waited another 5 minutes before I worked up the courage to look through the gap at the bottom of the door. The hallway light cast a thin strip of yellow across my floor, unbroken by any shadow. He was gone, but he knew. He knew exactly where I lived and what I had. I did not sleep that night. I pushed my couch against the front door, wedged a chair under the handle, and sat in the corner of my bedroom with the bat across my lap and my phone in my hand, finger hovering over the emergency call button. Every creak of the building made me flinch. Every footstep from the apartment above sent a jolt through my spine. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a car engine start in the parking lot below. I crawled to the window, staying low, and peered through the blinds. The dark pickup truck was pulling out of its spot, headlights off, moving slowly toward the exit. I watched it turn onto the main road and disappear into the night. Part of me felt relief. A bigger part understood that this was not over, that he was simply waiting, calculating, figuring out his next move. I thought about calling the police right then, confessing everything, letting them sort it out. But every time I reached for the phone, I imagined the questions they would ask, the suspicion in their eyes, the handcuffs clicking around my wrists. By morning, I had made a decision. I was not going to wait for him to come back. The next morning, December 21st, I drove to the police station on Morse Road before I could talk myself out of it. I brought the shoebox with me, all $14,600 still inside. I asked to speak with someone about the Weiss case, and they put me in a small interview room with fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects. A detective named O'Connor came in after about 20 minutes, a heavy-set woman with tired eyes and a coffee stain on her shirt. I told her everything. The envelope, the locked door, the timing, the man who knocked, the pickup truck. She listened without interrupting, her face completely unreadable. When I finished, she left the room for almost an hour. I sat there convinced I was about to be arrested, that my life was effectively over. But when she came back, she had a different look on her face, something between relief and grim satisfaction. They had a suspect, she told me. A man named Ronald Hutchins, 44 years old, a former locksmith who had done work at my apartment complex 2 years ago. He still had master keys. The police had been tracking him for days but could not find the stolen money. Now, they could tie him directly to both locations. Ronald Hutchins was arrested that same afternoon at a motel off Interstate 71, about 30 miles south of Columbus. He had another $8,000 in his possession, the rest of what he had taken from the Weiss home. According to Detective O'Connor, he had planned to retrieve the money from my apartment once the investigation cooled down, using me as an unknowing hiding spot. Franklin Weiss survived his injuries and was able to identify Hutchins from a photo lineup. The trial happened the following spring, and I had to testify about finding the envelope in the night he came to my door. Hutchins stared at me the entire time I was on the stand, his eyes flat and empty like a shark. He got life without parole. I moved out of Birchwood Commons 2 weeks after his arrest and found a place across town. A building with security cameras and a doorman and deadbolts I check 3 times every night. Sometimes I still wake up at 3 in the morning, certain I heard footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes I dream about those 3 slow knocks. But the money is gone. Hutchins is in prison, and I am still here. The Christmas, I spent the holiday alone, eating Chinese takeout and watching old movies, and it was the best Christmas I ever had, because I was alive to see it. Winter break had just started, and everything about that day felt ordinary in a way I didn't appreciate at the time. School stress was finally quiet. My biggest concern was helping my mom with groceries, and the house felt full because my dad had taken time off work. I was 16, restless, and trying hard to feel older than I actually was. Money was tight in our house, but not desperate, and I had a part-time job that made me feel proud every time I checked my wallet. That afternoon, my mom asked me to walk to the small convenience store a few blocks away to grab milk and bread. The air was cold enough to sting my ears, and the sky had that dull gray look that always comes with the holidays. I remember thinking how calm everything felt, like nothing bad could fit into that day. That calm made what happened next feel even more unreal in hindsight. Near the entrance of the store, a man stood just off to the side, not blocking anyone but close enough that you couldn't ignore him. He wore a thin jacket that didn't match the weather and shoes with the soles peeling away at the edges. His hair was uneven, like he'd cut it himself in a hurry, and his hands were red and cracked from the cold. He asked quietly if anyone could spare a few dollars, not in a dramatic way, more like he was embarrassed to even speak. When he looked at me, his eyes lingered a second too long, studying my face instead of my clothes. I hesitated, feeling that familiar pressure to be a good person, especially around the holidays. I pulled out a bill from my pocket and handed it to him, and his fingers brushed mine longer than necessary. He thanked me, but his voice sounded flat, almost distracted. As I walked inside, I caught a glimpse of him watching me through the glass. By the time I got home, the encounter had already started to fade from my mind. The house smelled like food, and my parents were arguing lightly over what movie to watch later. I mentioned the man outside the store in passing, mostly to explain why I'd spent more than expected. My dad nodded but didn't seem concerned, and my mom just told me to be careful next time. Evening settled in quietly, the neighborhood outside our windows going dark, one porch light at a time. After dinner, I went to my room, put on headphones, and lost track of time scrolling on my phone. Nothing about that night felt threatening yet. If anything, it felt safe in the boring way home usually does. It was already late when a strange sound pulled my attention away from the screen. At first, it sounded like metal brushing against metal, faint and irregular, coming from somewhere below my window. I pulled the headphones off and listened, holding my breath without realizing it. Another sound followed, sharper this time, like a handle being tested. My room faces the front of the house, and the curtains were slightly open, letting in the glow from the streetlight. When I leaned closer to the glass, my chest tightened as I saw a shape moving near the front door. A man stood on our porch, head tilted, hands moving from the knob to the frame as if memorizing it. Even from that distance, I recognized the jacket and the uneven hair. The realization hit hard. The man from the store had followed me home. I stepped back from the window and tried to convince myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe he was at the wrong house. Maybe he was confused. That logic didn't last long once I heard the slow scrape of his fingers moving along the door frame, then the soft rattle of the lock again. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it would give me away. I crept into the hallway and whispered for my parents, my voice coming out thinner than I expected. My dad came first, annoyance on his face until he followed my pointing finger toward the front door. We stood there in silence, listening to the careful, deliberate testing of our house. Whoever was outside wasn't in a rush. That scared me more than if he had been. My dad flipped on the porch light without opening the door. The sudden brightness revealed the man clearly, standing inches from the glass, his face calm in a way that didn't match the situation. He looked straight through the door, not surprised at all to be seen. My mom grabbed my arm and pulled me behind her, her grip tight enough to hurt. My dad shouted through the door, telling the man to leave, his voice firm but shaking at the edges. The man didn't argue or plead. He stepped back slowly, raised one hand in a lazy wave, and walked off the porch. None of us moved for a long moment after that. The silence felt heavier than the noise had been. We thought that was the end of it, and that assumption almost got us hurt. Less than an hour later, a crash echoed through the house, loud and violent enough to make the walls vibrate. The back door had been forced open. The lock splintered like dry wood. My mom screamed, and my dad grabbed the nearest thing he could use as a weapon. I stayed frozen near the stairs, my mind racing but my body refusing to follow. Footsteps moved through the kitchen, slow and confident, like the man knew exactly where he was going. When he appeared in the hallway, his eyes locked onto me first, and something in his expression shifted. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. What happened next felt disjointed, like my brain couldn't process it in real time. My dad rushed him, and the two of them collided hard against the wall. The man fought back with a strength that didn't match his thin frame, knocking over furniture and sending picture frames crashing to the floor. My mom dragged me into a bedroom and locked the door, shouting for me to stay put while she called for help. I could hear everything through the thin walls, grunts, curses, the dull thud of bodies hitting the floor. At one point, there was a sharp cry of pain that cut through the chaos, followed by a long stretch of silence. I sat on the floor with my knees pulled to my chest, shaking so badly I could hear my teeth click. The police arrived after what felt like forever but couldn't have been more than minutes. Red and blue lights flooded the windows, turning the bedroom walls into something unreal. When the door finally opened, my mom's face was streaked with tears, and my dad was sitting on the floor in the hallway, holding his side while an officer spoke to him. The man from the store was already in handcuffs, his face pressed against the carpet, breathing hard. There was blood on the floor that didn't belong to him. Paramedics came in next, asking questions too fast, lifting my dad onto a stretcher while he kept telling them he was fine. I remember staring at the broken back door, the wood torn apart like it had never mattered. That night ended at the hospital, the smell of disinfectant clinging to everything. My dad had a deep cut and bruised ribs, nothing life-ending but enough to change how he moved for months. The police asked me to repeat the same story again and again, about the store, the money, the way the man looked at me. Saying it out loud made the guilt heavier. I kept thinking that if I hadn't stopped, if I hadn't tried to help, none of this would have happened. My parents never blamed me, but I could see it in their faces that something had shifted. The world felt less predictable to all of us after that night. The man was charged and eventually disappeared into the system, but the damage stayed behind with us. We replaced the doors, installed alarms, and kept lights on at night even when it made the electric bill worse. My dad stopped sitting with his back to windows. My mom started locking the car the second she got inside. As for me, I stopped walking alone, stopped trusting that quick decisions didn't have consequences. The holidays lost their softness after that, replaced by a constant edge I still can't fully explain. Kindness stopped feeling simple. I'm sharing this here because I still think about that moment outside the store, how small it felt at the time. One bill, one choice. An ordinary afternoon that cracked something open in our lives. I don't regret wanting to help, but I do understand now that not every situation is what it seems. Some people don't want money, they want access. That night taught me something I never wanted to learn, and even years later it follows me. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Pay attention to who's watching when you try to be kind. Early December had settled into my routine in a way that always felt heavier than the rest of the year. Life at that point revolved around quiet days, working remotely, and long walks meant to keep my head clear during the darkest stretch of winter. The daylight vanished early, the cold had a sharp edge to it, and most people stayed indoors once afternoon crept toward evening. That solitude never bothered me much. It actually felt comforting back then. Walking my dog had become the one constant that grounded me when everything else felt slow and muted. The trail we used was public, familiar, and usually predictable, even when the temperature chased everyone else away. It ran alongside old, forgotten structures and jagged rock faces that caught the last scraps of fading light. Nothing about that walk felt reckless at the time, just routine and quiet. That afternoon felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that stiffens your fingers even through gloves. The sky had that dull winter color that makes it hard to tell exactly when daylight gives up. My dog, Rook, moved ahead with his nose low, pulling slightly as he always did when something interesting crossed his path. The trail was nearly empty, which wasn't surprising given the season and the time. Wind scraped softly against the rock walls, carrying faint echoes that made it hard to place distant sounds. I remember noticing how silent the abandoned buildings looked, their windows dark and lifeless. Even so, nothing suggested danger, just isolation. The kind of isolation that feels harmless until it suddenly isn't. Things shifted near a bend where the trail narrowed, and the rocks rose closer on one side. Rook stopped short, hackles lifting in a way I had never seen before. A low sound came from his chest, deep and sharp, completely out of character for him. He stared toward a hidden pocket off the path, a shadowed area partially concealed by broken stone and brush. I tried to calm him, assuming an animal had passed through, but his focus didn't waver. His body leaned forward, muscles tight, as if bracing for something unseen. The air felt different there, heavier, like the cold had thickened. My instincts told me to move on, yet my feet hesitated. Before I could react, movement broke the stillness from that concealed space beside the trail. A figure lunged forward with a speed that didn't match the surroundings, forcing everything into chaos at once. Rook exploded into action, barking and pulling hard enough to nearly tear the leash from my hand. The sound of boots scraping against stone echoed sharply between the cliffs. My heart hammered as I stumbled backward, trying to keep distance while understanding dawned too late. This wasn't an animal or a coincidence, but a person who knew the terrain far too well. The realization hit in fragments as I struggled to keep my footing and my dog between us. Fear took over completely, not as panic, but as a clear, urgent need to survive. Rook planted himself between me and the man, teeth bared, barking in a way I'd never heard before. The leash burned into my palm as I tried to hold him back without pulling him away from what he was clearly trying to protect me from. The man shouted something I couldn't make out, his voice rough and uneven, like he wasn't used to speaking to anyone at all. His clothes were layered and dirty, mismatched for warmth rather than appearance, and his face looked gaunt in the dim light. There was a smell, too, something sour and unwashed that cut through the cold air. He stepped closer, then hesitated when Rook snapped forward. The distance between us felt paper-thin, fragile, like one wrong move would collapse it. Instinct finally pushed me into motion, and I yelled as loudly as my lungs would allow, the sound tearing out of my throat. My voice bounced off the rock walls and echoed down the trail, far louder than I expected. The man flinched, clearly not anticipating noise or resistance. Rook surged again, forcing the man to step back toward the shadows he'd come from. I stumbled sideways, nearly slipping on loose gravel, but kept screaming until my voice cracked. The man cursed under his breath, his eyes darting toward the trail entrance as if measuring escape routes. That moment of hesitation was everything. He retreated a few steps, hands raised defensively, then vanished back into the hidden area like he'd never been there at all. The walk back felt endless, every sound amplified by adrenaline and fear. My legs shook as I half-dragged Rook toward the trailhead, scanning every rock and broken structure for movement. Each crunch of gravel behind me made my heart spike again. When I finally reached the parking area, relief hit so hard it nearly knocked me over. I called emergency services with numb fingers, struggling to explain what had happened while watching the tree line. Rook stayed pressed against my leg the entire time, eyes locked on the trail like he expected the man to reappear. The operator stayed calm, grounding me as officers were dispatched. Waiting there in the cold felt unbearable, but leaving felt worse. Later that evening, officers confirmed they had found someone living nearby in makeshift shelter tucked between the cliffs and abandoned buildings. They told me he'd been using the winter months to move unnoticed, taking advantage of how empty the trail became. Evidence suggested he'd been watching people and animals for weeks, maybe longer, without anyone realizing. Hearing that made my skin prickle in a way that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. That path hadn't been empty because it was safe, but because it was overlooked. Knowing how close that encounter came to something far worse still makes my chest tighten. I don't walk that trail anymore, and Rook never tugs toward it either, like he remembers just as clearly as I do. In the days that followed, the details kept replaying in my head at the most random moments. I'd be making coffee or answering emails when the memory of that sudden movement beside the trail would surface without warning. Sleep came in short stretches, broken by dreams where the rocks felt closer than they really were. Rook became more alert on our walks, stopping often, scanning areas he used to ignore. I changed our routine completely, choosing busy streets and daylight hours only. Friends told me I was being cautious, but none of them had seen how quickly an ordinary place could turn dangerous. The quiet of December didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like cover. A few weeks later, I was contacted by an investigator who asked if I could come in and answer more questions. They explained that the man had been arrested and formally identified as a transient individual who had drifted between isolated areas during colder months. He wasn't just hiding from the weather, but from people. They found signs that he'd been tracking animals along the trail, leaving food scraps and markers I never would have noticed. Hearing that made my throat tighten. It wasn't random. It was intentional. The isolation of winter had given him exactly what he needed to stay unseen. What unsettled me most was learning how long he'd been there without anyone realizing it. The trail hadn't changed, but the absence of people had created blind spots no one questioned. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to walking past that hidden area without Rook reacting. That realization carried a heavy weight, one that made me grateful and uneasy at the same time. The officers told me my report likely prevented further harm, maybe even saved someone else from crossing his path. I nodded when they said it, but it didn't feel heroic. It felt like luck mixed with instinct and a dog who sensed danger before I did. Now, when December rolls around and the days shorten again, I remember that walk with a clarity I didn't ask for. Life moved on, routines adjusted, and the fear eventually softened, but it never fully disappeared. Rook still walks beside me, older now, slower, but just as watchful. That trail remains open to the public, but I haven't returned, and I don't plan to. Some places carry memories that don't need revisiting. What happened ended that day, with an arrest and a clear outcome, yet the awareness it left behind stays with me. I trust my instincts more now, and I never ignore my dog when he tells me something isn't right. That New Year's Eve still feels unreal to talk about, even now. At the time, life was pretty ordinary for me. Long work days, a small apartment I barely decorated, and a habit of saying yes to plans just so I wouldn't spend another holiday alone. I'd gone to a low-key party thrown by a coworker, nothing wild, mostly people standing around plastic tables with cheap champagne. Midnight was getting close, and the mood shifted into that nervous excitement people get when they expect something meaningful to happen just because the calendar is changing. I remember checking my phone over and over, watching the ride prices spike higher and higher. Every bus route nearby had already stopped running, and my last backup canceled on me without warning. I didn't want to stay, but I also didn't want to panic. When a shared ride option popped up, I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before accepting it. At the time, it felt like the safest choice left. The car pulled up a few minutes later, a dark sedan with fogged windows and a faint smell of old coffee when I opened the door. The driver barely acknowledged me, just nodded once and tapped something on his phone. The interior light flicked on briefly, enough for me to notice how clean the back seat was, almost staged, like nobody ever really sat there. As we pulled away, fireworks started popping somewhere in the distance, muffled and uneven. I buckled in and opened the app, watching the blue line draw itself across familiar streets. The first few blocks matched exactly what I expected, and that relaxed me more than I realized. I texted a friend joking about how I'd probably miss midnight in traffic. The driver kept the radio off, which made the car feel strangely sealed off from the night outside. A few minutes later, the route on the screen recalculated, and the blue line bent in a direction I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was just avoiding traffic, something the app does all the time. Streetlights thinned out, replaced by longer stretches of darkness between intersections. I glanced up and noticed we hadn't passed another car in a while. The driver didn't explain the change, and I didn't ask, not wanting to seem paranoid. My phone buzzed as midnight hit, lighting up with a bright Happy New Year notification that felt oddly cheerful, given how quiet everything had become. Fireworks were still going off somewhere far away, but none were visible from where we were. The app showed us moving, but the surroundings didn't match anything I recognized. I remember thinking how strange it was that a night meant for celebration could feel so empty. The road narrowed further until the car slowed near what looked like a closed bridge, barricades pushed to the side like they'd been moved before. The driver stopped without saying a word, engine still running, hazards off. I asked if there was a problem, trying to keep my voice steady, but he didn't answer or even turn around. That was the moment fear really set in, sharp and undeniable. I unlocked my door and stepped out, telling myself I just needed space and a better signal. The cold air hit my face, and the car rolled forward slightly, just enough to make me stumble back. By the time I looked up, the sedan was already pulling away, taillights disappearing into the dark. I stood there alone, staring at my phone as the app refreshed, and then suddenly showed nothing at all. That's where my memory starts to blur, right before everything went silent. The last clear thing I remember is walking toward the edge of the bridge, hoping to get a better signal or spot a nearby building. My phone screen kept dimming and brightening as notifications tried to come through, but nothing loaded properly. The wind off the water below was sharp and constant, carrying a damp smell that made my eyes sting. I tried calling emergency services, then a friend, then anyone, but every call failed immediately. That was when I noticed how quiet it was. No traffic, no voices, not even distant fireworks anymore. I told myself to stay calm, to retrace my steps, but when I turned around, the road behind me looked longer than it should have. The barricades near the bridge cast uneven shadows that shifted when clouds moved across the moon. I felt like I'd stepped into a space the city had forgotten to finish building. Time became difficult to measure after that. My phone battery drained faster than normal, even though I wasn't using it much anymore. I remember sitting on the cold ground near the barricade, pulling my coat tighter and listening to the water below. At some point, I heard footsteps on gravel and stood up too quickly, calling out without thinking. No one answered, and the sound never came back. My phone buzzed once more, showing that same Happy New Year notification again, as if it had just arrived. That didn't make sense, and staring at it made my head feel heavy and unfocused. I set the phone down beside me, thinking I'd pick it up again in a second. The next thing I remember is waking up with daylight in my eyes, and no idea how I'd gotten there. I was lying a short distance from where I'd been sitting, my coat damp and my head pounding. The bridge was still closed, still empty, but the daylight made it look less threatening and more neglected. My phone was gone. Panic hit hard as I searched the area, checking under barricades along the edge, even shouting for help. After a while, a maintenance worker arrived in a pickup truck and stared at me like I was a problem he didn't want to deal with. He asked if I was okay and said someone had found a phone nearby earlier that morning and turned it into the local station. When I got there hours later, they handed me my phone sealed in a bag. The screen still lit up with that same midnight notification, time-stamped exactly at 12 a.m., untouched by anything after. What unsettled me most came later, when I tried to report the ride. There was no record of it, no driver, no route, no payment, nothing. Support insisted I must be mistaken or confusing it with another trip. Even my location history showed a gap during those hours, like I'd simply vanished for part of the night. I stopped using shared rides after that, and I don't stay out late anymore, especially on nights when everyone else is distracted by celebration. Sometimes I still wake up thinking about that quiet road and how easily I accepted a ride just because I didn't want to be inconvenient. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed in the car. All I know is that something about that night never added up, and it never fully let me go. For a long time after that, I tried to explain it away with exhaustion, stress, maybe even alcohol. though I barely drank that night. Friends listened politely, but their eyes glazed over once I mentioned the missing ride history and the gap in my location data. A couple of them suggested I must have accepted a different car or walked part of the way and forgotten. I wanted to believe that too, but the physical details didn't line up. The smell of damp metal near the bridge, the way the wind cut through my clothes, the driver's silence. Those memories stayed sharp, not fuzzy like a blackout. Every time I unlocked my phone, I half expected that notification to disappear, but it stayed there until I eventually deleted it myself. Even then, the date stuck in my head like a bruise you keep pressing just to see if it still hurts. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, and I went back during the day. I parked nearby and walked toward the bridge on foot, trying to convince myself it was just another neglected stretch of road. In daylight, it looked smaller than I remembered, almost disappointingly normal. There were fresh tire marks near the barricades, though, and footprints leading toward the edge that didn't look old. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching the water move slowly underneath, feeling that same hollow quiet settle in. No one questioned why the bridge was closed, and no one seemed surprised it stayed that way. It struck me how easy it was for a place like that to exist unnoticed, even inside a city full of people. I left without taking photos, afraid of what I might capture if I tried. What finally pushed me to do something practical was realizing how close I'd come to being another unresolved story. I filed a report, not expecting much, just wanting my account on record somewhere official. The officer was polite but distant, typing as I talked, pausing only when I mentioned the ride disappearing from the system. He told me cases like that were hard to pursue without data, without a driver ID, without anything concrete. Still, he advised me to trust my instincts going forward and avoid shared rides late at night. It wasn't comforting advice, but it was the only thing he could offer. Walking out of that station, I felt both relieved and deeply unsettled, like I'd just acknowledged something no one else could really help me with. Now, whenever New Year's Eve comes around, I stay home. I watch the countdown on TV, muted, and keep my phone face down on the table. The idea of celebration layered over vulnerability doesn't sit right with me anymore. Sometimes I think about that car, how ordinary it looked, how easy it was to step inside without asking more questions. Nothing dramatic happened in the end, no chase, no confrontation, and somehow that makes it worse. Whatever that night was, it ended without explanation, without closure, like it simply decided to let me go. I don't understand it, and maybe I never will, but I know one thing for sure. I won't ever ignore that quiet warning feeling again, no matter how inconvenient it might be.